Hi everyone, welcome to another video. I am Rougons-Macquart, and today I'm going to review two books that both talk about a similar topic, and that topic is the working situation of the working class in northern France. And the two books are one of my all-time favorite, might have talked about this book earlier, Germinal by Emile Zola, and the other is the lesser known Daewoo by Francois Bon. Now, before I talk about the books themselves, I want to tell you a bit more about why I find this topic interesting, and that is because I am, or at least my family is, from the north of France. So I've got this connection to that region. And whilst, as far as I know, my family is mostly farmers for the past generations, I'm pretty sure that somewhere a grandmother of mine, like not the direct grandfather, but ancestors, have breathed in coal for a longer period of time. Now, northern France is a very poor region still today. The front line of the First World War pretty much went through it, and they suffered a lot as a result from that and never recuperated, and the Second World War didn't really improve things, and you still see nowadays when you walk through forest, for example. My grandfather always used to point out that the ground was, that you had this going on, and that was still a result of the trenches that were there during the First World War, and you still have a lot of cemeteries of soldiers that died during the First and the Second World War. You've got a lot of tanks and things that are still there, half broken. And in the city that my grandfather and grandmother live in, there are still bullet holes on some of the sides of the buildings. I have this vivid recollection just not that long ago of still bullet holes being in the hospital. And that is very weird. You see still the poverty, you see that the region hasn't recuperated and that they're struggling to come out of that. It's not necessarily a happy place. And I find these books then interesting because they talk about why the region is how it is and what has happened and why it still is this way. Now, for a long period of time, the people that were working there worked in the mines. Coal was big business, so a lot of the families were just all working in the mining industry. And that is what Germinal is about. It describes the lives of the miners. But at one point, when it became a lot more difficult to extract coal from the mines, and also sometimes prices fell because there was no war, and therefore there was no need for steel and coal, the miners were laid off because it was just too expensive to keep them on. For those people who think that we stepped away from coal towards oil for climate crisis kind of situations, no, not at all. It was purely economical. And the people, as they were not highly educated at all, ended up finding work in the factories that sprouted up because mass production became more and more of a thing. But then we have what happened in the last few decades, and that is globalization, and therefore it's more easy to relocate factories. And as there are places where workers have less rights, it's cheaper to build things in other countries. And that is what this book is about. It's about the closing of factories and the effect that that has on the people that are still in northern France. But before I dive more into the books on that level, I want to just tell you a bit more about the books and what happened in them. They're both very different, first of all, but Germinal. So, said previously, this is one of my all-time favorite books. And it's the 13th book in the Rougons-Macquart series that Zola wrote to describe the whole of the French society in the first half of the 19th century. And each novel can be read separately, although all the characters are linked through this family tree, that of the Rougons and that of the Macquarts. Yes, the family being Macquarts might explain why I love this series. Anyway, the hero, or main character, not really a hero, of this book is called Etienne Lantier, and he is Macquart on his mother's side. So his mother is Gervaise Macquart, and she is the hero of her own book called L'Assommoir, another of the better known books of this series. Now, at the beginning, Etienne Lantier is walking through northern France, and he's looking for a job because he's hungry, basically, and he was laid off from his previous job because he had hit his boss. And he comes across a mine called Le Voreux, and he joins a group of miners that were looking for a replacement because one of the people from their group didn't show up that day. And that group consists mostly of the Maheu family and some of their friends or associates. And the Maheus have been in the mines for generations, and at the time of the book, The grandfather is still working there, the father, and 3 of the 7 children. By following them, the reader really gets an idea of what life was like for the miners. Now, Zola is well known for his writing style, which is called naturalism, and that's a version of realism. He spends a lot of time on research in order to really be able to describe things in the way that they were, but then really add his own. He adds some kind of, in his descriptions, he adds something magical that really makes it all comes alive. So the mine, the way in which the mine is described, the mine is a living, breathing thing. And that just, it's wonderful. But I love this book. But all of the research that he did really comes through in the description of the life of the miners, which is what the beginning part of the book is mostly about. And we get their whole lives, starting from the moment where they wake up in the middle of the night and in the cold, trying to make themselves ready for work, basically, with all of them, the night, the cold, the going in the ground, the heat below. We've got the hunger, especially, that plays a big role, the way in which the kids are blamed for basically being mouths. We've got the promiscuity, we've got the sex, we've got all of the alcohol, we've got how everything is just the same for all the generations. It's fascinating. And what comes across especially is how the miners have not a lot of hope that their situation is going to change. Things are what they are, and they just hope that they're going to survive. They're so busy surviving that they can't project themselves and try to make changes, basically. But Etienne Lantier is not planning on keeping quiet and accepting this life. He has had an education, whereas the miners, well, as we see in the book, they hardly know how to read because it's not necessarily for them to read. They don't need that in the mine. And he read books about socialism, and he's trying to make sure this social security also becomes a thing in the mine. And he talks about the injustice and what they can do. And when the owners of the mine have financial difficulties and decide that they're going to cope that by lowering the wages of the workers, the combination of that injustice and Etienne talking to them about possibilities sparks a revolt, and they decide that they are going to go on strike, and the book follows that strike led by Etienne and what the results are, etc. In Daewoo, we don't follow one of two characters in the way that we did with Germinal. This is non-fiction, and it reads more like a collection of newspaper articles, which is helped also by the fact that Francois Bon is a journalist. So what Francois Bon did is that he was interested in this topic of what happened surrounding the closure of 3 factories in northeast France. And he goes there, and the vignettes comprise of his research, basically. So we've got interviews that he has with the women that were laid off. In the factories, it was mostly women that worked there. We've got descriptions of the factories themselves and how they're dismantled, which was pretty cool. We've got a little bit of history of how this whole came to pass, and mostly the reactions of the employees to the factories closing. It reads very much like little pieces of research, that they're not necessarily merged into one in the way that Zola did with his research. And therefore the vignettes, they don't really have one clear storyline. The bits that are interviews, they read very much like a stream of consciousness, and it makes sense because the interviews weren't very structured. It wasn't Francois Bon asking questions. It's basically just him recording the stream of words that came out of the women's mouths, them just describing the hell that they have been through and what they're still going through, and them talking to him is also for them a coping mechanism. So it does make sense to a certain extent, but I just don't like stream of consciousness, so that didn't help me. But that's just me. One thing that comes back throughout the book is the life of one person called Sylvie, and Sylvie is the person that kind of took leadership upon herself when there were discussions between the workers and the direction of the factories, and the other women then talk about the consequences that had for her, mostly on a personal level. As you can imagine, a lot of these women that were laid off, they don't have a possibility to relocate, and they all have to find another job in the same region, a region that is poor and where new job opportunities don't just come along. I mean, all of them are basically applying for that one job at the supermarket. And then you can imagine what it's like for Sylvie, who has this label put upon her that is the main troublemaker. Her life was pretty interesting and pretty sad. Now, so we've got both of these authors, and they tackle the subject of the working situation in northern France very differently. And of course, the social situations that they came from is very different. In the time of Zola, there was no talk of what the working situations of the lower classes was like. He was the first that did this, and it was a shock for the Parisian high society to discover what the lives of miners was like. Not that they changed anything, but that's not the fact for Francois Bon. Now we know what the working situations are like, and the things that happened in this book have also been in the news to a certain extent. The actual closing of the factories and the actions that the women take, kidnapping one of the directors at one point, those have been in the news. So to a certain extent, you can say that these women have had the voice that the miners here only had because Zola decided to write this book. But Francois Bon focuses most on the consequences of that and the lives of the women after that they have been laid off. And that is not something that you see very often. He describes how hard it is to find work and how there's a lot more sickness and cancer and that a lot of couples don't survive. He talks about how these women miss social cohesions because they don't see the other women anymore, and how some characters are ashamed and others are angry and others are just plain sad. I will say, I have this recollection of these different emotions from the people in the book, but somehow I don't have any recollection of the people themselves, except for Sylvie that I just talked about. They all kind of mingled together, and maybe it's because they were sharing in a stream of consciousness type of way, and they were sharing emotions, and I tend to still associate like actions to people, and as we didn't really see actions, I think that's why I don't see the people, I don't remember them. Whereas with Germinal, we have this action, and I do remember each of the characters very distinctly, and most of all, I see how each of them influence the narrative. I will say, yes, I have read this one already 3 times, but it makes me sad that these characters that are made up, basically, are more relatable to me somehow than the people in this book that actually exist. I do also think that that might be because, as this is in the past, and as the working situations that are described in here aren't true in the region that I live in, I think I might romanticize it somehow in my head, and that makes it easier to see the people as people, whereas with this, I become uncomfortable because I know that this is happening right now, and it makes you uncomfortable, and then we kind of look away, and I think that also influences the fact that that the peoples have somehow merged into my head, and I can't say, oh yeah, that one had this, that one had that. And I don't really like that about myself, but it's interesting that this book helped me see that in that way, to think about why I don't relate to these people. And another thing that plays a role is that Zola gives us a story. He constructed this so well. There's a definite build-up in everything that happens. Waving with your hands when you're holding a book is difficult, by the way. So there's a build-up, there's a narrative, it's going somewhere. You feel that there's a kind of logical pace to it. And with Daewoo, there isn't much of a pace. I'm not even sure that everything was talked about in a chronological order, but that also says something about me, I would say. I couldn't really place the vignettes corresponding to one another. I didn't know what I was supposed to compare it to, what came from what. So I don't think that helps, and I will admit that if it wasn't for wanting to compare these two, I would definitely have DNF'd this, because I couldn't make sense of it, basically. The part that I found most interesting in this book is the part that it talked about the CEO of the Daewoo Corporation, and how he decided, so it's a man from Korea, if I remember correctly, and he was blamed for corruption in his own country, but he's kind of heralded as this hero in France because he decided to open this factory and give jobs to people that were in dire need of them. considering also the fact that the factories were mostly opened through the help of financial aid from the state, and him then also getting the French nationality because there's these very clear ties with French politics. That was very interesting, and I would have been very interested in reading more about that and the whole thing that happened behind that. And we do see this link with the politics, the national politics, and we don't really see that in Germinal. We are shown the lives of the owners of the mines, but that has more to do with showing how their lives really contrast with that of the miners, and that was done wonderfully, and it was super fascinating. But it's not linked to the Parisian politics, which was the fact in Daewoo. One thing that was done very, very well in Germinal, but that I missed in Daewoo, see I switched them around, is how all of the things that happened at work also cycle through to the lives of people at home. Of course, that's related to the fact that in Germinal, the whole family worked in the mines. Like I said, grandfather, father, and then the kids. The kids, as old as the age of 8, have to go down to mines to make sure that there's enough money for everybody to be fed. And the kids that are younger than that, even babies, are blamed for just being a mouth and not doing anything. But that's a whole other topic, which was very interesting to read about. But you've got this influence in the family life. When something happens at work, they all talk about it. They all live. What they do in the weekend is still with their work friends, their work buddies. And I missed that in Daewoo. We've got all of these women that were laid off, that were sacked. And women are often, in some way, the pillars of the community because they don't only work, they don't only make sure that their kids could be fed, but they also do all of the housework. And I missed that discussion in this. I didn't really see, I mean, we have some examples of a woman that divorced her husband because life at home wasn't going well, but we don't really see how it cycles through in their conversations at home. We don't see what effect it has on their kids to see their mother just be sad all of the time. And I missed that. I thought that would have been super interesting. But I do also think that that is a result of this mostly being based on the experience of the women themselves. And I think they're just still too much in pain to be willing to have this conversation to see what that's like. And we don't have the distance yet to be able to have this conversation. But what we could see was how these ex-Daewoo employees were feeling so hopeless, even when they still had a job. They don't really know where they're able to go. They're just going through the motions, basically, and even after having been laid off and etc., they're just hurting. They're feeling hopeless about the future in general. And we also see that in Germinal, got this very poignant part where one of the characters, Catherine, talks about her expectations, and that's just horrible. None of the people that work there have hope of bettering their situation, and I think it's that hasn't changed much in all of this time. They don't have that. The people that we use for manual labor don't have these opportunities to rise up from the situation. Now, I can see why Francois Bon is said to be the Emile Zola of our generation, because both are very detailed and very descriptive. But if you have to choose, honestly, I would read this 100 times before rereading this even once, unfortunately. So I would highly recommend you reading Germinal. It's a wonderful book. It's very well researched and constructed, and it really brings you into what the life of these people is like. If you're interested in the consequences of factories closing in poor regions, then I do think this is still interesting. Beware that it's dry and a stream of conscience is like. Now that's all that I have to say, at least for the time of this video, about these books. I'd love to hear your opinions, especially on Germinal, because it's a well-known book and I know a lot of people who loved it. I will see you guys in another video. Thank you for watching. Bye.